The first thing Aaron Shaw noticed about the Interstellar Academy's logic gauntlet was not the warning holograms or the instructors pacing in ceremonial coats, but the sound. The examination dome hummed with a layered tone that reminded her of a tuning fork struck in a cavern, a resonance that seemed to settle behind the ears and vibrate through bone. The dome itself floated like a glass lung embedded in the Academy's spine, transparent on all sides, so that the stars hung beyond the test chamber like an audience. Beneath her boots, the entry platform locked with a magnetic click, and the harness at her waist tightened a notch to prepare for fractional gravity. Dozens of first-year cadets formed a crescent around the central well where the gauntlet would appear. She recognized the taut shoulders, the rigid jaws, the deliberate way hands were kept still. Anxiety, dressed up as discipline. She breathed once, steady and quiet, and kept her eyes forward. An instructor with silver-threaded hair and an expression carved from restraint stepped into the center. He spoke without amplification, yet his voice carried, as if the dome had been tuned for authority. The rules sounded ritualistic, and perhaps they were. The gauntlet would present a field of hexagonal tiles suspended in stabilized zero gravity. Each tile could be safe, volatile, or decisive. A misstep on a volatile tile would trigger a simulated detonation and reset the entire attempt to zero. Decisive tiles would cascade into new information if approached in a legal sequence. The session would run for 90 standard minutes, or until a candidate reached the control seam at the grid's far edge. No external computational aids were permitted. Proctors were free to alter gravity vectors at will. Failure rates were quoted without apology. A handful of alien cadets murmured in low voices, and a Brath student in reinforced vestments rolled his shoulders as if prepping for a brawl instead of a logic exam. Erin kept her hands clasped behind her back to hide the impulse to rub warmth into her fingers. The lights dimmed to a precise twilight, and the floor plates around the central well parted with the grace of a curtain. The grid rose from below, not like machinery, but like something alive remembering its shape. Hexagons unfurled into a honeycomb plane that floated above the well, each tile edged with a faint phosphorescent band. Symbols breathed along those bands in a slow cycle, too faint to resolve at a glance. The zero-G field activated with a soft chime. Erin felt her weight change by increments, the harness translating micro-adjustments into a gentle pull that reminded her she would not fall far. The tiles rippled, then held still, a luminous quilt stretched across nothing. Around her, classmates whispered tactics into wrist mics that went nowhere, out of habit more than necessity. A Valen student unfurled an extra eyelid membrane that sharpened contrast. A Kivron adjusted plates along a spine ridge, aligning proprioception with the dome's field lines. Two humans in the back argued in tight whispers about breadth-first versus depth-first clearing, as if the gauntlet would reward textbook purity. Erin let the debate pass through her like smoke. The grid's look had snagged something in her mind, a tiny hook catching on old fabric. Familiar, not in a grand way, but in the small domestic way a kitchen light switch looks familiar when a person returns home from a long trip. She frowned at herself for the thought and kept her face neutral. "Begin," the instructor said, and the dome obeyed. The timer burned into the air above the grid. 90 minutes, minus a breath. Cadets launched from the platform in cautious arcs, gripping the air with practiced micro-movements, boots skimming the edges of the tiles. The rules allowed approaches from any angle, but the field punished greed. A Tyran glided to the nearest cluster and extended a probe baton to tap a tile, an old habit from physical labs. The tile flashed crimson and hissed a warning, not a detonation. He withdrew, recalibrated, and chose another, tapping out a rhythm that looked confident enough to calm the hands that had begun to shake around him. Across the grid, a Brath planted both boots on a single hex and stood like a pillar while his eyes scanned the symbols along 3 adjacent edges. He stepped forward, and the hex under his heel flared a malignant orange that chased along the honeycomb like spilled ink. The dome pulsed once and reset his local cluster to a dead gray. Not a full detonation, not yet, but a hard slap on the wrist. Erin did not jump first. She waited long enough to see 3 distinct approaches fail: brute force probing, probabilistic hopscotch, and those aimless diagonals that panicked students always fell into when a field looked too large. The gauntlet rewarded patience, or so the veterans said. But patience could curdle into paralysis. She needed a foothold that would not steal time. The symbols along the tile edges continued to pulse, and her mind kept returning to the hook of familiarity. Numbers without numbers, positions without a grid label, patterns emerging not from calculation, but from adjacency. She felt a smile threaten at the corner of her mouth and erased it before anyone could see. She pushed off from the platform in a modest arc, crossing the short distance to a fringe cluster where the field lines felt least turbulent. Her boots touched a hex with a soft magnetic kiss, and the tile lit with a gentle silver. Safe. The edges to her left and right cooled into a subdued blue, while one edge brightened, showing 3 faint notches that were not quite numerals and not quite icons. Her chest loosened a fraction. She made her second move, not to the brightest invitation, but to the most informative neighbor, a tile that would intersect with the largest number of unknowns without exposing her to a forced guess. Safe again. The edges around it changed in a coordinated ripple. The notches repeated themselves with small variations. The dome's hum seemed to resolve into a harmony she had heard at a cheap terminal on Earth in a quiet apartment in a long summer where she had learned to keep her own company. She did not name the memory yet. Naming it would make it obvious, and obviousness could draw attention she did not want. The field around her reacted in precise increments. A revealed tile displayed 1 notch on a single edge where it touched an untested neighbor. Another tile showed 2 notches along edges that kissed 2 unknowns. No arcane symbology, no mystical logic, just a count of risk rendered as light. A third tile showed no notches at all, and when she stepped to its neighbor, a fan of safe hexes unfurled ahead like a door swinging open on quiet hinges. Air stirred across her face as the dome's ventilation compensated for the sudden changes in volume. Someone behind her muttered a curse when a chain reaction elsewhere forced a reset. A proctor shifted gravity by a fractional tilt, and a cluster of cadets drifted toward the dome's southern arc like leaves on a slow river. A Brath student landed hard 2 clusters to her right and glared as if the grid had personally insulted his ancestors. He launched again and ended on a tile that looked identical to the one that had hurt him before. The field punished him with another local wipe, and he swore with a wounded dignity that did not invite comfort. Erin kept her eyes on her own work. She drew a marker from her belt and placed a tiny luminous flag along the edge of a tile that, by the emerging logic, could not be safe. The flag wavered, then fixed, a silent promise she would not step there. She repeated the process at 2 more edges where notches summed to certainty. The grid did not reward flagging with points. The reward lived where it always had, in the way the next choice simplified itself. She worked without hurry, constructing a path that disclosed more than it risked. Each safe tile revealed the neighborhood around it with just enough information to predict the next one. When she hit a pocket dense with notches, she retreated a step and cleared a side corridor, letting the airflow of information curve back into the dead zone from a safer angle. The discipline felt like muscle memory, not the kind built in a gym, but the kind built at a screen at midnight when no one is watching. She remembered a chipped plastic mouse and a grid that pinged softly when her finger clicked. She remembered the stubborn pleasure of turning apparent chaos into a field of certainty, 1 square at a time. She remembered quiet victory, the kind that never asked for an audience. Minutes fell off the timer. Gravity shifted twice more, gentle waves that forced her to adjust the angle of each hop so her boot magnets would land cleanly. The harness at her waist flexed against her movements, reading intent and smoothing momentum, a partner that did not argue. She ignored the observation gallery where instructors watched with predatory calm. She ignored the way two peers began to track her progress, their paths deforming so they could glimpse how she was choosing. She did not hide her moves, but she did not announce them either. The gauntlet favored clear thought over performance. A snag appeared in the form of a tight knot of tiles where every adjacent edge showed two notches. A careless step would trigger a local wipe that could eat a quarter of her progress. She hovered on the nearest safe tile and let her eyes soften the way a person would when looking at a constellation, not for a single star, but for the shape between them. The answer came as a relief and as a reprimand. She had almost rushed. She marked two edges with flags, then stepped into the only remaining legal gap. The grid rewarded her with a blossom of silver hexes fanning out toward the center seam. On the far side of the dome, a Tyran gasped as a perfect run collapsed to rust under his boots. Reset. He drifted backward, expression blank, and composed himself for another attempt. Erin's breath stayed steady. Her mind had begun to enter that narrow hallway where time stops feeling like units and more like a slope. She moved tile to tile, laying flags at the edges that promised trouble, chasing clean corridors that revealed more than they risked. The grid began to look less like a threat and more like an old friend who had dressed in alien clothing to hide in plain sight. She allowed herself one small thought of humor. The Academy had wrapped a childhood puzzle in zero-G and ceremony and called it a rite of passage. At the 30-minute mark, a proctor pulsed the dome with a short-range scramble, a legal interference that blurred the edge symbols for 3 seconds. Panic flared around the grid. 2 cadets misstepped and paid for it. Erin paused and let the blur pass without moving. When the symbols clarified, the relations had not changed. She continued as if the interruption had been a breeze that ruffled a page without turning it. The halfway chime sounded not as a bell, but as a gentle modulation of the background hum. The grid ahead grew denser, with pockets of uncertainty knotted around the central seam. She did not rush it. Her route curved away, widened through safe ground, then angled back toward the seam from a direction that offered more revealed edges. A brath barreled across an open section and skidded to a halt as an entire cluster went hostile under his boots. Reset again. He punched the air once, then forced his arms to his sides like a man handcuffing himself. Erin cleared another corridor. The observation gallery stirred, a ripple of interest that she could feel even without looking up. She kept pressing, not faster, just cleaner. The hexes sang their small logic to anyone willing to listen without pride. At the edge of her awareness, she thought of Earth, and of a desk pressed against a window that looked out on a brick wall and a sliver of sky. She thought of an aunt who had told her that boredom was a teacher when no other teacher had time. She thought of how brilliance could be loud, but insight liked quiet. The dome's hum welcomed the thought and swallowed it, giving her back the simple next move. When the instructor called the final quarter, the grid threw one last misdirection. A cluster where 3 paths appeared legal and 1 was. She marked the traps and stepped into the correct corridor without hesitation. She did not smile. She did not look up. She simply moved. The seam was not close enough to touch, but it was no longer a rumor whispered across a field of embarrassment. It was a line she could reach with work done the right way, at the right pace, with respect for the fact that difficulty often wears theatrical clothing to hide a straightforward heart. By the time the session's first hour ended, Erin had advanced farther than rumor said a freshman could. The dome knew it. The instructors knew it. She knew it. She rested one boot on a silver tile and let the harness pull her weight into balance. The timer burned on. The grid waited, loyal to its small truths. She looked at the next set of edges, counted the notches without counting, and felt the quiet satisfaction of recognition settle in her chest like an anchor set into good ground. The gauntlet wanted awe. She offered understanding. The second hour of the logic gauntlet always shifted the atmosphere inside the dome. The initial nervous energy that pushed cadets into reckless moves had burned away, replaced by an unsettling quiet in which every choice felt heavier. Erin stood at the edge of her latest safe tile, breathing evenly as the harness absorbed the small corrections in her balance. The phosphorescent edges around her pulsed faintly, their glow reflecting against the inside of her visor. She studied them without rushing, her eyes moving across the pattern with the same casual precision she had once used when scanning the layout of an old Earth puzzle on a flickering screen. Across the grid, the failures had begun to show in posture. The Brath, who had started like a juggernaut, now moved with visible restraint, landing harder than necessary each time his boots found a tile. A Valen cadet clung to a cluster near the grid's edge, scanning in all directions before committing to even the smallest move. The Tyran sniper's gaze kept flicking toward Erin's position, his earlier confidence replaced by a faint crease between his eyes. Erin knew she was being watched, but she didn't let it change her pace. The grid rewarded consistency, and consistency meant keeping her movements as predictable to herself as possible, even if that meant being unpredictable to everyone else. She reached forward with one gloved hand and tapped the edge of the nearest unrevealed tile. The symbol on that edge brightened into 3 clean notches, enough to confirm that the tile was volatile. She marked it with a luminous flag and shifted her weight onto a tile that shared fewer unknown neighbors. As her boots settled, a chain reaction lit up 4 more safe tiles in a burst of silver light. She stepped onto the nearest one, letting the harness guide her trajectory so she didn't waste momentum. The numbers made sense in a way that was beyond calculation. She wasn't thinking about probability trees or advanced alien logic. She was simply reading the truth of the board the way a hunter reads the trail of an animal, seeing meaning in what others called noise. Halfway into her new corridor, a ripple of movement caught her eye. A Kivran cadet 2 clusters away had misread the adjacency and stepped onto a volatile tile. The simulated detonation was silent but spectacular. The tile flared into a deep orange, and the surrounding cluster drained to dead gray. The Kivran pushed back into safe territory with a hiss of frustration audible even across the distance. Erin didn't break her rhythm. Every second she spent watching someone else was a second she wasn't advancing, and in this test, forward momentum was survival. The Gauntlet's architects were not content to let the grid remain static. Without warning, the tiles under her boots shivered, and the entire field shifted laterally by a fraction of a meter. It was enough to scramble bearings for anyone who relied on spatial memory instead of logical mapping. Several cadets flailed in the air, their momentum carrying them into unsafe zones. Erin bent her knees and let the harness absorb the jolt, keeping her center of gravity low. The moment the tiles settled, she recalculated from her immediate position outward, ignoring the illusion that the whole grid had changed. She knew the relationships between tiles hadn't moved, only their positions in space. It was a test of perception, not logic. By the 70-minute mark, the number of active participants had dwindled. A few cadets still clung to the opening clusters, but most had either reset too many times to catch up or abandoned any real attempt to finish. Erin, however, had carved a wide swath into the heart of the grid. Each new tile opened corridors that fed into others, creating a map in her mind as detailed as any star chart. She paused at one junction, looking at 3 possible moves. The first was a gamble, 2 unknowns and no confirming symbols. The second was safe, but led into a dead end. The third offered the potential to unlock a larger section if her read was correct. She chose the third, stepping into the tile and exhaling slowly as its surface bloomed into silver. 5 more tiles revealed themselves in a cascade. She was aware now of the murmurs from the observation deck above. Instructors were never entirely silent, but there was a certain tone to their discussions when something unexpected was happening. Erin had felt it during other simulations when a cadet displayed an unorthodox but effective tactic. This time she knew it was about her. She wasn't moving faster than anyone else had in the Gauntlet's history, But she was moving without hesitation, and without error. That was the kind of thing the Academy noticed. With less than 20 minutes remaining, the Gauntlet's final stage initiated. A soft chime rolled through the dome, and a pulse of light washed over the grid. It dimmed the safe tiles and brightened the volatile ones for a single second before returning them to normal. To someone unprepared, the flash was nothing but disorienting. To Erin, it was confirmation, a glimpse at the minefield she had already been mapping in her head. She moved decisively now, threading her way between marked dangers, leaving behind a trail of flags like breadcrumbs. Her route began to curve toward the control seam at the grid's far edge. It shimmered faintly, a promise of completion, but she didn't let herself rush. The closer she got, the more traps the Gauntlet placed in her path. The pattern was familiar, clusters of 3s and 1s, the occasional 0 that opened a flood of safe ground. She marked, stepped, and cleared in a steady rhythm. She didn't think about the time left, only the next logical move. As the final minutes ticked away, she reached the penultimate tile before the seam. She paused, studying the edges. The notches told her everything. The tile directly ahead was volatile, the one to the right was safe. She shifted right, then forward, bypassing the trap entirely. The seam lit up in a column of white light as her boots touched it. The timer froze with just under 4 minutes remaining. A low tone filled the dome, signaling the end of her run. Erin straightened, breathing deep in the fractional gravity, and looked back over the path she had carved. From this vantage, it resembled the old puzzle boards she'd solved countless times, each safe space earned by patience and logic. The difference was that this time, dozens of eyes had watched her do it, and the Academy would remember. She turned back toward the platform as the harness reeled her in, already hearing the faint hum of whispered speculation from the other cadets. She knew what was coming next. Questions, disbelief, and the quiet resentment of those who had struggled while she had moved as if the Gauntlet were made for her. In truth, it hadn't been made for her at all. She had simply recognized its disguise. The moment Erin stepped off the harness platform, the murmur of voices followed her like a second gravity. Cadets who had finished earlier, or been eliminated entirely, were gathered along the observation deck's lower rail, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and something colder. She didn't meet their eyes. She removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements, each tug of the fabric giving her a moment to let the adrenaline ebb. Her pulse was still high, but it wasn't from panic. It was from the steady focus she had held for over an hour without slipping. An instructor intercepted her before she could return to the general floor. The man was tall, his skin pale under the dome's lights, and his expression revealed nothing of approval or disapproval. "Stay in the prep bay," he said simply, then gestured toward a side corridor. Erin obeyed without a word, following the muted hum of the bay's climate system. Inside, the air was cooler, scented faintly of sterilized composites and the metallic tang of recalibrated harness gear. She leaned against a counter, replaying the sequence in her mind. She had moved through that grid the way she once had through the small logic puzzles on her aunt's old terminal. No theatrics, no wasted steps, no panic when the board changed its angle. She could still see it clearly. The flag-marked traps, the blooming corridors of silver safe tiles, the seam glowing ahead like a quiet finish line. The strangest thing was how calm she had felt, even with instructors and peers watching. It hadn't been arrogance. It had been familiarity. The door opened, and a Valen cadet stepped in. He had been one of the earliest to fail, and now he studied her with an intensity that was sharper than curiosity. "You didn't guess once," he said flatly. Erin didn't reply, waiting for him to say more. "You knew where every danger was before you stepped. That's not how the Gauntlet works. No one maps it that fast without an algorithm." She met his gaze, holding it just long enough for the silence to make him uncomfortable. "Maybe you were looking for answers in the wrong place," she said finally. He frowned, as if unsure whether she was mocking him. Before he could push further, an instructor called him back to the main floor, leaving her alone again. When she emerged from the bay, the dome had been cleared for the next wave of cadets. Those who remained stood in small clusters, whispering in low tones. A Kivron she had seen attempting risky diagonal clears earlier approached her. His posture was open, but there was something in his eyes, a cautious calculation. "You saw something in the patterns, didn't you?" he asked. His voice was soft enough that it wouldn't carry. Erin adjusted the strap of her utility belt before answering. "I paid attention to what the tiles told me," she said. "The rest was just following the logic." She kept her tone even, neither dismissive nor confessional. He tilted his head slightly, then stepped back, as though filing away her answer for later. The day's schedule shifted after the Gauntlet, but Erin's run remained the undercurrent in every conversation she overheard. A Tyran in the mess hall muttered that she must have memorized a static pattern from a past year, which was absurd. No two gauntlets were identical. A Brath suggested she had been given a private tutorial by an instructor, which earned him a scoff from a nearby human who knew how little favoritism existed in the academy. Erin listened without reacting, quietly finishing her meal before excusing herself. Later that evening, in her quarters, she pulled out a slim datapad and opened a blank schematic grid. Her fingers moved in quiet arcs, sketching the path she had taken through the Gauntlet while the memory was still sharp. Each flagged tile, each safe corridor, each deliberate detour. It all went into the diagram. She wasn't doing it to boast or preserve a record. She was doing it because the exercise felt like closing a book properly, making sure the last page was in place. As she reviewed the map, she realized something that deepened her unease. The Gauntlet hadn't just tested logic. It had tested how cadets reacted to the unknown. Most of the others had treated it like a hostile environment that had to be conquered with brute analysis or speed. She had treated it like a conversation, reading the subtle cues each tile offered, letting the safe spaces open naturally instead of forcing them. The puzzle had rewarded that approach, but it left her wondering if the test had been designed to see who would notice such an alternative in the first place. Her door chimed, breaking her thoughts. When she opened it, she found an instructor standing in the corridor, tablet in hand. "Report to Strategy Room 3 tomorrow at 0600, he said. "You're being moved to an advanced analysis group." He didn't explain further, nor did he wait for her to acknowledge the order before turning away. Erin closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, the datapad still in her hand. An advanced group meant higher expectations, more difficult simulations, and, most importantly, more attention from those who decided long-term placements. It wasn't something handed out for luck. She knew her run in the Gauntlet was the reason, but she also knew it meant her approach would now be under a microscope. Every choice from here on would be measured against the quiet precision she had shown today. Setting the datapad aside, she sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the floor. She had turned a test meant to overwhelm into something familiar, but that familiarity might not come again. Whatever the Academy threw at her next would likely be built to resist such simple recognition. Still, the memory of the grid's unfolding logic steadied her. She didn't need the next challenge to feel familiar. She only needed to see it clearly enough to find the pattern. That was something no one could take from her. The strategy room was not what Erin expected. When she stepped inside at 0600, she thought she might find an extended classroom or a simulation bay with rows of terminals. Instead, the room was dim and quiet, built in a semicircle of tiered stations that faced a single floating projection in the center. The projection was an active simulation, its geometry shifting every few seconds, folding in on itself like an origami structure caught between forming and collapsing. Each shift was precise, mathematical, yet deliberately irregular enough to disorient anyone who watched too long. 4 other cadets were already in the room. She recognized none of them from her previous drills, which meant they were from different units, or, more likely, had been pulled here for the same reason she had. They stood in silence, eyes locked on the projection, until a woman in a dark gray uniform entered from the side door. Her rank insignia wasn't one Aaron recognized, but the silence that followed her arrival told Aaron the woman's authority didn't need to be announced. The woman addressed them without preamble. "You are here because the Academy monitors more than scores. We look for how a mind adapts under stress, how it finds unconventional paths without losing efficiency. Yesterday, Cadet Shaw demonstrated such a path in the logic Gauntlet." Aaron felt several heads turn toward her, but she kept her posture still. "Today, we will see if it was a repeatable skill, or a fluke." The projection shifted into something new, a sprawling three-dimensional grid suspended in layers above and below a central axis. Hexagons were gone. Now the structure was built of interlinked nodes, each connected to others by luminous pathways that pulsed in different colors. The woman explained the parameters in clipped tones. The objective was to move from a starting node on the outermost layer to the singular node in the center, avoiding pathways that would destabilize the structure. Instability here did not mean simulated detonation. It meant the collapse of an entire section, cutting off potential routes. "Think before you move," the woman said. "Every action changes the board, not just for you, but for everyone else. This is not a solo run. You will be working simultaneously, and your choices can help or sabotage each other. Intentional sabotage will be recorded as failure." Aaron understood immediately that this test was different. The Gauntlet had been a puzzle she could work through in isolation, shielded from anyone else's influence except for environmental shifts. Here, she would be navigating alongside others whose decisions could directly destroy the path she was building. Worse, she would have to make her own decisions, knowing they might jeopardize someone else's. It was not a test of pure logic. It was a test of logic under shared pressure. When the simulation began, Aaron started on the outer rim. Her first step was to examine the pathways leading inward. Each connection glowed with a soft pulse, its color indicating stability. Green was safe, yellow was risky, red was immediately unstable. But the complication came with the shifting cycles. Green could turn yellow, yellow could stabilize, red could clear if enough time passed without stress on its linked nodes. The trick was to choose moves that opened more options rather than funneling her into dead ends. Two cadets moved quickly, claiming nearby green nodes before the others could. Aaron didn't rush. She waited, watching the ripple effects of their moves. One cadet's choice turned an entire branch of pathways yellow, forcing another cadet to retreat to the outer ring. Aaron stepped into a green node that was not directly in anyone's immediate path, but had the highest number of potential safe exits. It gave her flexibility, and she suspected that was what this test was really about, maintaining viable options under shifting conditions. As the simulation progressed, tensions rose. The Brath cadet in the group moved aggressively, forcing others to adjust or risk destabilization. Aaron noticed a pattern. His movements often caused collapses 2 or 3 nodes later, not immediately, which suggested he was working on instinct rather than mapping the chain reactions. She kept her route deliberately away from his, choosing paths that overlapped minimally so his unpredictability couldn't undermine her work. The woman in gray spoke occasionally, her voice calm but cutting. "Cadet Miro, your last move eliminated 3 possible routes. Did you account for that?" Or, "Cadet Relin, you left no path open for return. Can you justify that risk?" Aaron noticed she never offered praise, only questions designed to force the cadets to explain their reasoning in real time. Halfway through, the projection shifted again, not resetting, but recalibrating. Pathways began to flicker between states faster, sometimes switching from green to red and back in under a second. This eliminated the luxury of waiting to see if a risky path would stabilize. Aaron adjusted immediately, focusing on sequences where the change frequency was predictable enough to time her moves. She took 2 quick steps across nodes that flickered green for only a heartbeat before slipping back into yellow. It was calculated, not reckless. She knew the pattern would hold just long enough for her to cross. By the final phase, only 2 cadets, including Aaron, were still on viable routes toward the center. The others had either trapped themselves in unstable sections or been cut off entirely by collapses. Aaron could see the last 3 nodes she needed, but the second to last was yellow, pulsing irregularly. The Brath cadet was approaching from a different angle, clearly aiming for the same central node. If he reached the yellow node first and destabilized it, her route would collapse. She didn't wait. Timing the flicker, she moved when the yellow brightened fractionally, an early sign it was shifting toward green. Her boots touched the node just as it stabilized, and she pushed off toward the center. The moment her hand made contact with the glowing sphere at the heart of the structure, the simulation froze. The projection dissolved, leaving the room in silence except for the faint hum of the equipment. The woman in gray regarded the group with the same unreadable expression she had worn from the start. Observation complete. You may leave. She didn't announce results, didn't offer ranking, just turned away to consult her tablet. As the others filed out, Aaron stayed a moment longer, watching her. She wanted to know whether her approach had been what the woman had expected, or something else entirely. But the woman didn't look up. Out in the corridor, one of the other cadets caught up to her. He was tall, with the lean build of someone trained for speed rather than brute force. "You read that board like you'd already seen it," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Aaron shook her head. "I just looked for the moves that wouldn't trap me later," she replied. He gave her a slow nod, as if weighing whether to believe her, then fell back into step with the others heading toward the lifts. By the time she returned to her quarters, Aaron understood something that had been vague before. The Academy wasn't only testing who could solve a problem. It was testing who could solve it while other people tried, intentionally or not, to ruin the solution in progress. The Gauntlet had been a test of pure logic. This was a test of logic under social and tactical pressure, and she knew, with a certainty that made her pulse steady, that the next challenge would combine both. The summons to the command observation wing came without explanation, delivered by a courier drone that hovered outside Aaron's quarters until she acknowledged the message. The coordinates on the notice were for a section of the Academy she had never entered, an area above the primary simulation decks, where only senior instructors and visiting strategists were allowed. She left immediately, walking through corridors that grew quieter and less populated the higher she climbed. The air here was cooler, the lighting subdued, as if even the environment understood that this was a place for watching, not speaking. When she reached the observation wing, a uniformed attendant scanned her ID and ushered her into a narrow chamber lined with high-backed chairs. In the center was a massive transparent wall that looked down on the largest simulation dome she had ever seen. Inside, the floor was an unbroken expanse of dark material, perfectly flat, without the grids, tiles, or nodes she had become accustomed to. At first glance, it looked like nothing, but the faint shimmer above the surface suggested layered holographics waiting to be activated. 2 instructors stood near the glass. One of them, a broad-shouldered human with a clipped voice, addressed her without turning away from the view. "Cadet Shaw, you're here because you've demonstrated an ability to break our training constructs in ways that weren't intended. Some call it adaptability. Others call it inconvenient." The other instructor, an older Valen whose pale eyes reflected the dome's glow, added, "We want to see if you can do it again, when the construct is actively working against you." Before she could ask what that meant, the shimmer in the dome intensified, and the surface resolved into a shifting landscape. Ridges of metallic ground rose and fell like the breathing of some enormous machine. Each movement created new patterns, lines that intersected and dissolved before the eye could follow them. It was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead at a time, and those steps could vanish within seconds. The Valen gestured toward the entrance hatch. "Your objective is simple. Reach the beacon at the center. You'll be timed. and the field will not hesitate to erase any path you find." Erin nodded once, descended the narrow ramp into the dome, and felt the hatch seal behind her. The scale of the space was overwhelming from inside. The horizon was closer than it appeared from above, but the constant undulation of the floor made it difficult to judge distance. The beacon, a slim column of light, pulsed faintly somewhere ahead, but already the terrain between them was shifting. She stepped forward carefully, feeling the faint vibration beneath her boots that preceded each movement of the surface. It was a warning system of sorts, but unreliable. Sometimes the vibration signaled a slow rise, other times an abrupt collapse. She moved diagonally, avoiding the most active sections, and began marking safe footholds in her mind. Each safe point, however, was temporary. Several vanished behind her within moments, as if the construct were erasing any trail she left. 5 minutes in, she realized that conventional mapping was useless. This was not a puzzle with fixed rules. It was a living system, reactive and unpredictable. And yet, as she moved, she began to notice something. The ridges didn't shift entirely at random. Certain sections repeated their motion cycles, returning to a familiar shape before changing again. If she could time her movement to these cycles, she could cross ground that would be impassable for anyone relying on static mapping. She tested her theory, waiting on a narrow platform until a ridge ahead began its predictable rise. When it leveled, she crossed quickly, landing on the far side just before the section behind her dropped away. The path ahead continued to shift, but now she moved with more certainty, timing each step to patterns she had identified. The beacon was still distant, but no longer abstract. It was reachable. Then the construct adapted. The cycles shortened, and some sections began to shift out of sequence, breaking the patterns she had memorized. It was a countermeasure, designed to punish over-reliance on timing. Erin slowed her pace, watching for any residual order beneath the chaos. She found it not in the ridges themselves, but in the seams between them. The seams shifted less dramatically, and when they did, the movement was always lateral, never vertical. By following these seams, she could thread a route through the instability without relying on fragile timing windows. Halfway to the beacon, a sudden surge in the floor's movement nearly threw her off balance. The entire field began rising and falling in larger waves, creating moments where she could see far ahead but had nowhere stable to stand. She crouched low, absorbing the motion through her legs, and scanned for the next seam. It appeared briefly to her left, a pale line between two massive sections. She ran for it, catching the seam just before the sections on either side buckled upward. As she drew closer to the beacon, the construct introduced another complication: false beacons. Smaller columns of light began to appear at random points, pulsing in the same rhythm as the true beacon. The trick was subtle but dangerous. Choose the wrong one, and the floor beneath it would drop away entirely. She ignored the decoys, keeping her focus on the original beacon's position relative to the dome's walls. The real one never shifted in relation to its surroundings, even when the terrain did. With less than 2 minutes left on what she assumed was the hidden timer, Erin reached the final stretch. The last expanse was the most volatile yet. Sections rose and fell in rapid, almost violent cycles, and the seams between them were narrower than before. She moved without hesitation, using a combination of short leaps and timed sprints to cross. The final seam opened just as she landed, and she surged forward, reaching the base of the true beacon. Her hand touched the smooth surface, and the column flared to blinding white. The terrain froze. The constant motion ceased, and the dome fell silent except for the faint hum of the projection system. Erin stood still for a moment, letting her breathing steady, before the hatch reopened and the instructors beckoned her out. Back in the observation wing, the human instructor regarded her with a thin smile. "You don't just solve problems," he said. "You make the problem rewrite itself until it fits your solution." The Valen's pale eyes studied her for a long moment before he added, "That will serve you well, if you remember that not every construct is as willing to be rewritten." Erin didn't respond. She understood the meaning beneath his words. Some systems fought adaptation harder than others, and some punished it. But as she left the observation wing, the image of the frozen terrain behind her stayed vivid in her mind. It reminded her that even the most unstable ground could be navigated if she understood its rhythm, and that somewhere beyond the academy, the challenges waiting for her would not be simulations. They would be real, and the consequences would not reset. She felt no fear at the thought, only a quiet certainty that when those moments came, she would move through them the same way she had moved through the Gauntlet, the shared grid and the living terrain, step by deliberate step, seeing the pattern where others saw only chaos.